Hello, I am Dr. Crystal Downing. I am the newly appointed co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, along with my husband, David Downing. And we are delighted to have you here on a very exciting evening. I want to see hands. Is there anybody here who has never been to the Wade before? Good. Yeah, great. I want to introduce Patti Callahan, and the screen behind me introduces her, but you have a much greater treat in meeting the real person here tonight. When I was in my first semester of grad school, I read an essay called The Indefatigable Charles Dickens, and it was about this amazing output by Dickens, all these brilliant novels. And at the time, I had to look up the word indefatigable and figured out, oh, it means he doesn't suffer fatigue. He just keeps producing and producing. And in the OED, they might be able to add a little note. A newer definition of indefatigable would be Patti Callahan Henry. Since in 12 years, she has published 13 novels. Her 14th is coming out this spring or summer. And the one you're hearing about tonight is the most recently published, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, and it is very special, not only because it is her first foray into historical fiction, but because it is about C.S. Lewis, about whom this whole center has been established, to archive Lewis's manuscripts, letters, but also to archive documents from 6 of his closest friends and influences. And I hope you can come back sometime where you can dip into all we have here for you. And Patti Callahan dipped into resources here that helped her formulate this novel about Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis. Before I introduce her, I just want to say there will be a book signing where you could purchase her book at the front desk, as well as, and I know this is going to happen, you are going to become intrigued by Joy Davidman after listening to Patti. And her novel is just a wonderful way to hear about this woman. We also have for sale a biography on Joy Davidman. And that will be available for you tonight as well. Patti Callahan has a very interesting background because her BA from Auburn University was in nursing. Her master's was in pediatric nursing. But then she decided she wanted to write a novel. And she got her first novel published in 2006. By her 6th novel, which is called Driftwood Summer, she was on the New York Times bestseller list. She was shortlisted for the Townsend Prize for Fiction and nominated for the Southeastern Independent Booksellers Novel of the Year. And this novel that you're going to hear about tonight is already a USA, it only came out in October. It's already a USA bestseller, one of the Christian Science Monitor's top books of the year. It has been a starred Publishers Weekly, a starred Library Journal review, and it is written by a very delightful human being. So, welcome, Patti Callahan Henry.
You're so sweet. Thank you. Thank you, love. Thank you. Oh, we're tangled. You have to stay up here with me. Hey, all. Oh, wow. There's people here. I was sitting on the front row, and then I looked out, and there were. Thank you for coming tonight. I want to start with thanking the Wade Center, not only for putting this on tonight. We've had a really full and fun day. We did a podcast. We did a 4 p.m. thing on publishing. But if the Wade Center wasn't so meticulous in their collections, and if they weren't so careful with the papers of our beloved authors and their wives, this book wouldn't be anywhere near what it is. It wouldn't be as rich or as deep, if it can be at all, because the things that I was able to discover and the woman I was able to come to know by digging through these files, made her come alive in a way that she wouldn't have if I hadn't had the Wade Center. So I want to thank y'all. I get a little emotional. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell you that my favorite part about these kind of events is the Q&A. And if you're here, you probably want to talk about this. So I am going to talk a little bit about why I wrote the book and who Joy Davidman is, but then I really want to open it up for discussion. And the first thing I'm going to do is sort of address the primary question in a place like the Wade Center, which is known for its biographies and known for its academic papers, is why I would fictionalize Joy Davidman's love story with C.S. Lewis. So I'm just going to hit on that for 1 minute before I dive in. I'm a novelist, so that's the main reason. But I believe in the power of story. That's why I'm a novelist. We are hardwired to understand the world through story. Our brains are always looking for meaning and looking for story in the world. And I felt like it was time that Joy was introduced to the world in something beyond biography. And her biographies are amazing. You will learn so much about her. They're narrative, they're beautiful. But I know that in my world, the best way for somebody to come alive again is in narrative form and in story. So that's why I wrote a fictional novel about her, although it is really based on fact, heavily based on fact. I spent about 3 years doing the research. So let me tell you a little bit about it. In the mid-1940s, there was a woman named Joy Davidman. She was an award-winning poet, she was an essayist, she was a novelist, she was a critic, she was a screenwriter, and she was writing a book on the 10 Commandments called Smoke on the Mountain. And in the front of that book, she wrote an essay on fear. And in that essay, she wrote one of my favorite lines by Joy Davidman, and it's this: "If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us?" Isn't that a great question? If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? And I wanted to see how she answered this. So I finished the essay and I finished the book, and she didn't answer it. And then I realized that she didn't answer it in that essay or in that book because she answered it with her life. And that was the kind of woman she was. She went off from writing that and spent the next 10 to 12 years on a transformational journey that not only changed her life, her heart, her work, and her family, but the life, the work, and the heart of one of our most beloved authors of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis. So, how did that happen? That is the question I wanted to know. How did this woman set off and change this man's life? Because we all fall into our own kind of love with C.S. Lewis. Can I have who's read? Okay. So I fell into mine when I was 10 years old, and I read the Screw Tape Letters. Screw Tape Letters? Okay, you shouldn't read it when you're 10, right? Okay, because I think I followed that up with This Present Darkness. Remember that book? Anyway, I was scared for a while. But then I fell through the wardrobe door of Narnia, and I've been reading Lewis for all of my life. My father is a pastor. His bookshelves were lined with Lewis books. But Lewis only loved one woman enough to marry. Only one woman he called earth, stars, air, and water. Only one woman he called my sister, my mother, my lover, my friend. There was only one woman, and her name was Helen Joy Davidman Gresham, called Joy. His name was Clive Staples Lewis, but to his friends he was called Jack. And their 10-year relationship has led to more gossip, more stories, a movie, essays, bantering, argument, debate, and now a novel. Because the story is so fascinating. This is my 13th novel, and all of my novels, in one way or another, have dealt with the vagaries of love, how they affect our lives, what it means for us, what we're like in relationship, what we're like when relationships come apart. But I'm never interested in the fairy tales of the princess in the castle and the prince coming to save her. And Joy was definitely not a princess in a castle waiting to be saved. Joy was a fiery woman who made a journey from New York to London to Oxford, back to New York, back to London, back to Oxford. So here they were, two of the most improbable love story people you could not possibly imagine. In this time in the 1940s, Joy was a married woman living in upstate New York. She was married with 2 children. She was an award-winning poet, an essay and novelist. She had never left New York for all of her life, except for the 6 months she was a screenwriter in Hollywood. She was also a Reformed Jew, an ex-atheist, an ex-communist, living in upstate New York. Over here you have C.S. Lewis. People often think about him as a theologian, but he wasn't. He was a lay theologian, but he was the tutor of English literature at Magdalen College. That's who he was. He specialized in medieval literature. He was not a preacher. He was a teacher. He was the tutor of English literature. He had never left Ireland or England for all of his life, except for the 6 months he was in the war in France and was injured. How were these two people to have ever met, to have ever become friends, to have much less fallen in love, and then much less married? It seemed impossible until it wasn't. During their 10-year relationship, C.S. Lewis wrote some of, in my humble opinion, some of his greatest works on love, on grief, on the true self behind the veil. And yet joy is rarely acknowledged, except in the inner circles or somebody who's read her biography. Joy is rarely acknowledged for the wife, the best friend, the muse, the editor, and the co-author or collaborator that she was with C.S. Lewis. So, starting tonight, we're going to stop talking about the woman behind the man. Can I get a witness? Okay, and we're going to start talking about the woman beside the man, and that was Joy Davidman. She was much more than the wife of, especially the dying wife of C.S. Lewis. Joy came to me when I was kind of at a dead end in my creative life, when I didn't know what I wanted to do next. And I was stuck, and I was with a tribe of my writer friends in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was talking to another historical writer at the time, and we were talking about being stuck in our creative lives and how to tap back into that good unconscious goo to find out what might be next. And I believe that when we're in stuck places, sometimes the worst thing is advice and the best thing is a question. And she happened to ask just the right question that night. My defenses were down, I wasn't thinking, and she said, "Patti, what would you write about if you could write about anything you wanted?" And I didn't hesitate. I'd never thought about it before. I'd never said it before. I'd never written it in my journals that must be burned on my death. I never had, said, "Oh, this is a dream," and it just came out. I said, "I would write about Joy Davidman." And she said, "Who's that?" And I said, "That's the problem. She is so fascinating, but she is the wife of C.S. Lewis, and she's been buried in the Shadowlands." And I said, "But I don't write historical fiction." And she said, "Well, I do. I'll do it." I said, No, I got it. I've totally got this. Joy and I are a team. We're doing this. In fact, I've been researching it for all my life, which in a way was true, because I had been researching it for all my life because I'd been reading Lewis's work, and I knew about her. So that was the biggest problem, was that I knew about her. So I immediately went home and I started diving into figuring out who Joy Davidman was and how this improbable love story could have possibly happened. And I found two camps, and I think the Wade Center will tell you this too. There were two, when I first started researching, I was finding two diametrically opposed camps about Joy Davidman. First, there was the brash New York woman who inserted herself into Lewis's life. Then over here was the enchanting, brilliant, fiery woman who was the first time Lewis had ever found his intellectual equal in this person. Someone who had enchanted him so much that it had changed his work and his life, and he had married her. And I decided I was going to set out to find which one of these she was. And I started reading, I started doing research, I started looking at some of her old papers. And it took me not very long to realize that I didn't anymore want to hear about her, that I wanted to hear from her. And that was the only way that I was going to be able to tell the story that I was setting out to write. I knew that it was going to be fiction, but I knew it was going to be heavily based on fact. So I decided to do what I call going to the primary source. I went to Joy herself. And fortunately for me and for you, Joy was a prolific writer. She has volumes of published letters, poetry, 2 novels, essays, a book on the 10 Commandments. And then there were her unpublished papers also, which are here at the Wade Center that I came to read. And so I came here and I, read some of the unpublished things she has in her files. And I held her passport, which Julie told me today isn't called a passport. What was it called? English registration. I read her divorce decree, which is one of the harder things you'll ever read. It's really hard. Look, I get choked up talking about it. And she came alive for me in a way she never would have when I started holding those papers. So what I started doing was building the storyline as if I was building her as a person. And I made sure that the skeleton was entirely built of irrefutable facts. Things we cannot argue about, things that just are what they are. When they were, she and Lewis both, when they were born, when her children were born, when books were published, when she moved here, when she took a ship here, she came twice. All of those things I built. My office looked crazy, but I had these timelines running across with notes on them. Eventually, the publishing house has made a really gorgeous dual timeline of Joy and Jack. It's on my website if you care. Shows every book when it was published, when they graduated from college, when he went to the war, when she graduated, when she wrote her thesis. So I built that skeleton, and that took a long while. While I was getting to know her, I built that skeleton that was solid and sure, built of fact. It took some years. And then after that, I put the skin of what I deemed the emotional truth on that skeleton. And that emotional truth came straight from Joy. Not what other people thought about her or said about her or wrote about her, but what she said, what was in her poetry, what was in her letters. I'm writing about a very finite period of her life where her in-depth biographies cover all of her life. My novel covers the 10 years that they knew each other. And really, I only in-depth cover the first 7. And she has loads of letters and poems she wrote during that time. And it's been, I think, maybe 6 years since they found the box in Oxford. And in that box in Jean Wakeman's house, they found a box of her unpublished papers, and in there was a folder with the word courage on it. And inside that folder were 45 love sonnets, and it said 45 love sonnets for C.S. Lewis. And so I had those too. So then on top of that skeleton and that skin, I put what I call the clothes of imagination and inspiration. And even those clothes, which include their discussions, what they said to each other, what they wrote to each other, they're not necessarily fully imagined because they are inspired and known by what they said and wrote and did to other people during that time. We don't have to make it up. Lewis and Joy both were avid letter writers, and we can know what they were talking about and thinking about, what was going on in the world at that time and how they felt about it. So that is how I built that. And then when I was done, I decided that there was no way I was going to finish this novel until I visited the places where they walked. Setting has always been really important in my novels. We have a couple budding writers here, so I'm going to talk about it for a second. We often talk about setting being another character in a novel, and it is that, but I like to think of setting as the petri dish from which the story grows, in that the story could not take place anywhere else. That you could not pick up this story and put it in another town, another city, another school, and have it make sense. So setting has always been incredibly important to me. So I went and I suffered for my art, and I went to London and Oxford. It was hard. I had to go to the pubs. That was tough. But I arranged the trip completely based on what was in the rough draft. And I did that on purpose instead of visiting first, because I could have spent 6 months over there and then missed the 5 places that ended up in the novel, because I couldn't know what was going to end up in there. So I arranged a trip called In the Steps of Joy, and I went almost everywhere that's in the novel, except I think Edinburgh, and I didn't visit her house in Belsize Park till last week, or 2 weeks ago. But most of the other places I have visited or gone to during that research trip. And then I rounded out that novel, and it came out. So let me introduce you to her just a little bit for those of you who don't know her very well. Joy was born in April of 1915 when C.S. Lewis was 16 and a half years old. She was born to 2 immigrant parents, Russian and Polish immigrant Middle European parents, in a part of New York called the Jewish ghetto. So if you think about the early 1900s, we have to remember how important it was for assimilation and accomplishment for immigrant families. She grew up in a really strict household. But they knew she was a genius from a very young age, and they expected a lot of her. You can read a lot more about her childhood and what went on in some of her really in-depth biographies. But she could read by the time she was 3 years old. She had graduated from high school by 14, entered college at 15, graduated from graduate school at Columbia by the time she was 19 years old. In her 20s, she won the Yale Younger Poet Award. It's still huge, winning the Yale Younger Poet Award. She had published a novel in her 20s. Then finally, through a series of broken hearts and a little bit of angst, she finally met the man, another writer named William Gresham, called Bill. He was also a writer and very successful. They were both kind of in the New York literati of the 30s and 40s. And Bill Gresham wrote a book called, it became a movie called Monster Midway with Tyrone Power. But he was also, had fought in the Spanish Civil War. And Joy's book of poetry called Comrade-in-Arms had been about the Spanish Civil War. So they bonded, and they married, and they had 2 young sons named Davy and Douglas. From the Spanish Civil War, Bill probably had what we would today call PTSD. He was charming, he was smart, he was witty, he played the guitar, he was a beautiful writer, but he was also very wounded, and he was an alcoholic, and he was unfaithful, and they had a lot of problems. Well, when she had 2 young children named Davy and Douglas, one night Bill called and said he wasn't coming home, that he didn't know what would become of him, but he wasn't coming home. And it is told, Joy tells us, that she that night had what she calls a mystical experience, that she found herself on her knees, and she didn't understand why. Because at this point, Joy was not only an atheist, she had declared herself an atheist at 9 years old when she read H.G. Wells' History of the World, but she was also a communist at this time. So we always have to put things in context. In the 1930s, when she was in college, she had seen a young woman commit suicide, jump off the top of a building at Hunter College. And this had spurred her eventually to try and remedy, during the Great Depression, people going hungry. She had joined the Communist Party. And she would have called herself a materialist. And this communist atheist materialist didn't understand why she was on her knees. But she said something or someone entered that room with her, and she called that presence love. And she said that her ego cracked open, and I never want to get her words wrong. She wrote an essay, an eloquent essay called The Longest Way Around, about that encounter. She said she called the loving presence God, and that to articulate the ineffable, she said the experience was like waking up, and that she had taken her life watered down, diluted by time and space until that moment. In those 30 seconds, she forgave enemies, understood God had always been there, and realized how much energy she had expended keeping him out. She called herself the world's most astonished atheist. Do those words sound a little familiar? In Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis said he was the world's most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. So they both described their experiences similarly. But for Joy, mystical equaled experiential, and she'd had a mystical experience. And then she wrote my second favorite quote of hers, which is that life is too intense to be endured with logic alone. Isn't that great? Life is too intense to be endured with logic alone. And Joy Davidman, being the curious and the intellectual woman she was, she set off to understand what that 30 seconds meant. Somebody else might have put it on the back burner and said that it was just an emotional reaction to another really bad night, but she didn't. She wanted to find out what it meant. And she had read Lewis and had considered him kind of fanciful, but she decided to turn back to his work and read some of his work. So I'm going to put this a little bit in context. This is in the mid to late 1940s. Narnia has not come out yet. The first Narnia came out in 1951. But Lewis had been on the cover of Time magazine by then, and there had been an article about him in the Atlantic Monthly called Apostle to the Skeptics by a man named Chad Walsh. That Joy eventually became very dear friends with him and his wife, Ava. But she read that article, and she said, okay, that's who I need to talk to, the Apostle to the Skeptics. So she wrote to Chad Walsh and said, I need to talk to this C.S. Lewis person. And Chad Walsh said, well, he answers every letter that is written to him. So write to him. And she and her husband both wrote to him, but it was Joy and Lewis that began a 3-year pen friendship. 3 years they wrote back and forth until April of 1952, when Joy boarded a ship and went to England for a number of reasons. She was working on a book about King Charles. She had some ill health she could get better care for in England. She had a friend, but yes, she finally got to meet her friend Jack, that she had been writing letters with for 3 years. And this is where the story gets really good. And not because it gets easy, but because it gets anything but easy. Because this is where both Joy and Jack have to overcome not only external obstacles, but internal obstacles, where both Joy and Jack have to be willing to break down the barriers and change their lives, where Joy and Jack both have to overcome so many obstacles to finally be together for the last 3 years of their life. So why do we want to bring back this story? Why do we want to talk about a woman who is long gone, who's been memorialized in a movie and has some biographies? Why do we need to bring it back? Why do we need to talk about her now? Because I believe that she has something to say to us today. Joy, all of her life, was looking for something more, but she believed it only existed in fairy tales, poetry, and once in a while she would get a glimpse of it in nature. She also used to have a dream all the time that she called fairyland, where she would be walking down a long trail toward a castle, but she would always wake up before she got there. So Joy only believed in that something more until that experience. And she's here to say, just like all of us saying, isn't there something more? What is that something more? Joy wanted to find something that satisfied her heart, her intellect, and her logic, and then the experience that she had. And she never stopped asking the questions. She never stopped seeking. She never stopped looking. She wrote to C.S. Lewis about it. She was not willing to give up on finding out what that something more was. And then she changed her life. Now, we might not all need to pack up our kids and get on a ship and move to England, right? Although today it sounds really good. But we all might need to pack up everybody's expectations of us, and other people telling us who and how to be, and society's demands. She shows us that you don't have to take the crumbs off the table of anyone because somebody else tells you that you must. For all of her life, Joy was told who and how to be. As a child, when she rebelled, she might have been what we would today call the strong-willed child. Anybody else got that? Okay. As a child, it earned her slaps across the face. As an adolescent, she was often homeschooled. She had some bizarre medical treatments because sometimes they couldn't figure out what was going on with her. She wore a radiant collar for a while. As an adult, it made her tolerate verbal abuse, infidelity, alcoholism, until she couldn't and until she didn't. And that doesn't mean it wasn't hard. I was in the reading room today looking at some annotations she had made in The Problem of Pain. And in there, she wrote something to the effect of, well, what if you surrender to God's will and things get worse? And on paper, it's true. Sometimes her life looks like it actually got more difficult, not less difficult. And yet, she was growing towards what she called her inner light, her true self in God. And so that led to her wholeness, which led to her being able to fall in love with C.S. Lewis. And I often say that for C.S. Lewis, in the last 13 years of his work, for him to change our lives, she first had to change her life, right? Because if she hadn't changed her life, she wouldn't have entered his life and changed his. But she had to change her life first. And her transformational journey is fascinating. Love, she shows us, is worth the convoluted and complicated path of changing our life, even when other people don't agree. Searching for the truth is worth the convoluted and complicated path of changing our life, she shows us. So that is why I wrote about Joy Davidman. So I'm going to read just the very beginning because I made a decision, as I said early on, and then I can't wait to hear what y'all want to talk about. Oh, I nailed it, 7:28. I was like skipping around in my head trying to do it faster. I really want to talk for a minute about why I decided to tell it in the first person. So I decided to tell it in the first person from the very beginning because I realized that I needed to tell this from her and not about her, that I needed to sit in the seat of her heart. Lots of people have lots of things to say about her, and guess what? They're all right. Every single person who talks about what she was like to them is right, because it was their mirror. It was who she was to them. But what about sitting in the seat of her heart, who she believed she was in all her vulnerabilities? I can't even say the word, much less be it. All of her vulnerabilities, all of her brokenness, all of her woundedness, all of her mistakes. I wanted to sit in the seat of her heart, even when I totally disagreed with her. When I was writing this novel, there were parts of it I wanted to leave out, and she wouldn't let me, because it's all of her. And I put the parts in we might disagree with. I can't do all of them or it'd be a trilogy, but I did put in even the parts that I would disagree with. I wanted to write this from what I call the key of empathy. And the only way to write from the key of empathy is to write from behind someone's eyes. And that's what I did. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the prologue, and then we're going to open it up. Prologue. You would not have called to me unless I had been calling to you. Aslan, the Silver Chair, C.S. Lewis. 1926, the Bronx, New York. From the very beginning, it was the great lion who brought us together. I see that now. The fierce and tender beast drew us to each other slowly, inexorably, across time, beyond an ocean, and against the obdurate bulwarks of our lives. He wouldn't make it easy for us. That is not his way. It was the summer of 1926, and my little brother Howie was 7 years old, and I was 11. I knelt next to his bed and gently shook his shoulder. Let's go, I whispered. They're asleep now. That day, I'd come home with my report card, and among the long column of A's, there was the indelible stamp of a single B denting the cotton paper. Father. I had tapped his shoulder, and he'd glanced away from the papers he was grading, his red pencil marking students' work. Here's my report card. His eyes scanned the card, glasses perched on the end of his nose, an echo of the photos of his Ukrainian ancestors. He'd arrived in America as a child, and at Ellis Island, his name was changed from Yosef to Joseph. He stood now to face me and lifted his hand. I could have backed away. I knew what came next in a family where assimilation and achievement were the priorities. His open palm flew across the space between us, a space brimful with my shimmering expectation of acceptance and praise, and slapped my left cheek with the clap of skin on skin, a sound I knew well. My face jolted to the right. The sting lasted, as it always did, long enough to stand for the verbal lashing that came after. There is no place for slipshod work in this family. No, there was no place for it at all. By the time I was 11, I was a sophomore in high school. I must try harder, be better, abide all disgrace until I found a way to succeed and prove my worth. But at night, Howie and I had our secrets. In the darkness of the bedroom, he rose, his little sneakers tangling in the sheets. He smiled at me. I've already got my shoes on. I'm ready. I suppressed a laugh and took his hand. We stood stone still and listened for any breaths but our own. Nothing. Let's go, I said, and he laid his small hand in mine, a trust. We crept from the brownstone and onto the empty Bronx streets. The wet garbage odor of the city as pungent as the inside of the subway. The sidewalks, dark rivers, the streetlights, small moons, and the looming buildings' protection from the outside world. The city was silent and deceptively safe in the midnight hours. Howie and I were on a quest to visit other caged animals forced to act civil in a world they didn't understand, the residents of the Bronx Zoo. Within minutes, we arrived at the Fordham Gate and paused, as we always did, to stare silently at the Rockefeller Fountain. 3 tiers of carved marble children sitting in seashells, mermaids supporting them on raised arms or sturdy heads, the great snake trailing up the center pillar, his mouth open to devour. The water slipped down with a rainfall din that subdued our footfalls and whispers. We reached the small hole in the far side of the fence and slipped through. We cherished our secret journeys to the midnight zoo. The parrot house with the multicolored creatures inside, the hippo, Peter the Great, a flying fox, the reptile house slithering with creatures both unnatural and frightening. Sneaking out was both our reward for enduring family life and our invisible rebellion. The Bronx River flowed right through the zoo's land, the snake of dark water seeming another living animal brought from the outside to divide the acreage in half and then escape as the water knew its way out. And then there was the lion's den, a dark, caged, and forested area. I was drawn there as if those beasts belonged to me or I to them. Sultan, my voice was resonant in the night, Bodam maid. The pair of Barbary lions ambled forward, placing their great paws on the earth, muscles dangerous and rippling beneath their fur as they approached the bars. A great grace surrounded them, as if they had come to understand their fate and accept it with roaring dignity. Their manes were deep and tangled as a forest. I fell into the endless universe of their large amber eyes, and they allowed, even invited me to reach through the iron and wind my fingers into their fur. They'd been tamed beyond their wild nature, and I felt a kinship with them that caused a trembling in my chest. They indulged me with a return gaze, their warm weight pressed into my palm, and I knew that capture had damaged their souls. I'm sorry, I whispered every time. We were meant to be free. So, what do y'all want to talk about? Oh. While she's getting the microphone, let me tell you that, the reason I opened with The Lion was because one of the most thrilling things for me when I started doing my research was seeing these ties that I hadn't seen mentioned before, like her great love of lions and then Aslan, right? And one of the things I noticed, and somebody's probably written about it or talked about it, I just hadn't seen it, is that at the end of her essay on The Longest Way Around, which is the essay she wrote about her experience, said that in our peace is in God's will, or I'm paraphrasing, but our peace is in God's will. And then the last thing she said before she died to C.S. Lewis, right before she passed away, she said, I am at peace with God. And I feel like those two bookend statements, what she wrote at the end of her conversion essay and what she said at the end of her life, were kind of a miraculous little bookend, that she had realized that her peace was in God's will, and at the end of her life she said, I am at peace with God. And I thought that was really beautiful. So tell me what y'all want to talk about. I know you have questions.
If you'd wait for the microphone, we are recording this, so we'll make sure we get your question on the mic.
I can repeat them too if you would like.
Patti, that was outstanding. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about David and Douglas Gresham and what their reception has been, not just to your book. Lots has been written about her, but about your notion of putting yourself in the voice of Joy and how they've responded to that, and if they offered any contribution to you in terms of your research and putting this book together.
Absolutely. I love talking about Douglas. Well, Davey passed away about 3 years ago, so I have no idea what he thinks. And when I look back, I realize, how long has it been since Davey passed away? Has it been about 3 years, a little more? 2014. See, I knew you would know. Yeah, so it's been 4 years. Well, what I realize now is that I probably started right about the time worked on this for about 4 years. This is a great story, or I love this story. So I knew that I would have to eventually talk to Douglas. And Douglas is alive, and he's in his mid to late 70s, and he is entirely in charge of the C.S. Lewis estate through the C.S. Lewis Company. I have so many experts here, I'm checking for verification. I'm looking around like, just nod if I'm wrong, or raise your hand if I'm wrong. And I knew that eventually I would have to talk to him or the C.S. Lewis Company to get permission, because each chapter starts with a love sonnet, with some of her poetry, with a love sonnet or a piece of poetry. And I put real words into their mouths, things that they both said and wrote in an essay or in a talk. So there's direct quotes inside the novel, and I knew I would need permission. but I think I was playing Scarlett O'Hara, like I'll worry about that tomorrow, because I just wanted to tell the story I wanted to tell. And I have a load of historical author friends and an agent and publishing houses who all gave the same advice, which was don't yet talk to the family. If you want to tell it from her, just tell the story and then do what you need to do. And I was writing the book in secret, even when I came here to the Wade Center and glommed onto poor Elaine over here and didn't let go. I never told her what I was doing. I never told anybody what I was doing. So the last thing I was going to do was tell Douglas what I was doing. So time went by, and I had asked Elaine enough questions and sent her enough emails that she knew something was up. And then I had asked a question that only Douglas could answer, and it was about why his parents had called each other Poogle. And he actually didn't know, but Elaine found it. So I was just about to try to figure out a way to talk to him when I got an email from him. I think someone gave him my email. Mm-hmm. And so it said, hello, Patti. My name is Douglas Gresham, and I hear you have been asking after my mother. May I help you? I was like, oh no. No. This is where it all goes wrong. This is where it ends. 4 years of work, and this is where it ends. And I wrote back to him and I said, my name is Patti Callahan, and I have written a novel about your mother. And I've written a novel about your mother because I admire her. And I've written a novel about your mother because I believe she has something to say to us today. I've written about your mother because I believe that she was ahead of her time in both how she struggled with motherhood and writing and marriage and being a Christian in a world that she didn't understand. And I feel like your mother has something to say to my generation of women who only know her as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis. And I've written about her because I really think that she's an example for us. And then I waited, and there's a big time difference between here and Malta. So I didn't get an answer, which is where he lives. And then he finally wrote back, and I need to look back, but it was essentially bravo. And so then we started talking. We talked by email, we talked by phone until a month or two in. I knew he was in the United States doing some lectures, and I asked him, I said, where are you? Because he was kind of all over the place that day. And he said, today I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. And I said, I'm in Spartanburg speaking at a library, do not move. And he didn't, and I went and spent the day with him. So yes, he has been incredibly supportive. And in any ways that he hasn't been, they haven't been shown or said to me. He has been helpful. He has told me stories. A couple of them ended up in the book because it was, still revision time. It's always revision time until it goes to press. Mm-hmm. And so I added some things that he told me, and I strengthened some things that he told me I was right about. And so I went back and strengthened those things. And he's been supportive since the day it came out, since the day it was sold, and it went through permissions quickly and easily at the C.S. Lewis Company, and nothing ever stopped it on its way out. So don't be afraid to ask a question. That was a really long answer to a really simple question. But the story of coming to know Douglas is one of so many stories of perfect synchronicity or providence or whatever the word is that you want to use that happened with this book in ways that made it exist in pathways that I couldn't have forged myself. So that's just one of them. But it was a good one because it's Douglas. But I was nervous when I got that email. I was like, I mean, I don't know how I'd feel if some woman was asking after my mother. I don't know. So anybody else have any questions? Just right here.
So I'm a history major, so I need to ask about you using your primary sources.
Okay.
And so what was kind of one source that maybe really changed the way you wrote the book or had a really big influence on it or something like that?
Absolutely. So the two biggest things that had influence on me for this book were her letters. Her letters are unbelievable. There's a book of published letters, and then here at the Wade Center there are unpublished letters. Her letters read like a journal. Her letters read like a novel. She describes everything she sees, everything she feels, from the sheep out the window of the train to the anxiety that grips her when she gets to Edinburgh to do her research and realizes she's been gone from home too long and she's cold and she's tired, she's getting the flu. And she explains it in this language that is inspiring. She's a beautiful writer. I was, like I said, in the reading room today, because I'm a dork, and even though the novel is done, I'm still like going through all her papers. And I was looking at her thesis from when she got her master's degree at Columbia. So let's remember, when she wrote this thesis, she was 19 years old or so. When she graduated, she was about 20. When the thesis was published, she was 20. The language, the way she described why she wrote about the man she wrote about. The opening line is, "Some men, it may be remarked, are poems. Others only make poems." That was the opening to her thesis when she was 19 years old, right? So she was just this powerful force in writing. Whether you love her poetry or dislike her poetry, there's no doubt that she had enough primary material for me to read. So the two most fascinating for me were her published letters and her unpublished letters, and then her poetry. I do enjoy her poetry. I think much of it is beautiful, but her letters to me was where her prose really shined. So thanks for asking. I like bragging on her. So I think she's an amazing writer. So yes, ma'am.
Well, I think you brought out.
Wait, you have to say it in the microphone. I'm sorry.
I have a pretty loud voice.
It's for a recording.
For the recording. Oh, sorry. I forgot what I was
Pretend
gonna
it's
say.
not for a recording. Just ask what you want to ask.
One of the things, I haven't quite finished the book, but one of the things that I felt was the strongest that came through to me was the power of letter writing, which you just
yes.
mentioned, because to be able to get to know and feel the tremendous connection that she felt with C.S. Lewis through letter writing, I thought you brought out very vividly in your book. And I really, just on a personal note, I met my husband of 52 or 3 years or whatever it is, when I was a freshman.
We lose count after 25 is what I say.
When I was a freshman in college, and I thought he was a nice guy and all that. But junior year, I went to Paris to study for the year, and we exchanged letters. And that's when our whole relationship changed, when we were not even,
Together,
right? So this brought out a personal note. And one of the questions I had for you is, when you're talking about the skeleton and then putting the clothes on the
skin,
skeleton, how do you bring in the dialogue? Do you stop at each chapter, or does it just present itself? Or?
So we were talking about this at lunch today, because both the Dr. Downings are very accomplished authors, and how sometimes the thing that looks the easiest and flows the best was the hardest work. And that's so true, especially for part one of this novel. There's 4 parts: America, England, America, England. And that first part where I have to show their relationship, but can only show it through snippets of letters because it's told from the first person. So we can't get into Lewis's life and show what's happening in his life, but we have to show how intimately they became connected in a very short time over words and debate and letters. So it was really important to me to show that, and it took me a really long while to figure out how to do that, honestly. I never want to make it look like it was like, oh, I just wrote about Joy. At first there were entire letters, and I realized that when I read a novel, I skim over the entire letters. And I wanted to find a way to show how intimately connected they were becoming in their day-to-day life. So I finally hit me, I think it was about 2:30 or 3 in the morning, when either good things or bad things flow into my head. And I realized that it had to be, and David described it great today, a conversation between them in the middle of life. So I would drop you into a scene, and then the letter would have to do with what she was going through. And then a little bit later, his letter would have something to do with what she was going through, so that we were in her life seeing a letter, in her life seeing a letter, and understanding why, in the middle of a marriage that was coming undone, in the middle of raising 2 wild little boys, why this relationship would nurture her so much. And that's what I mean about writing from the key of empathy or from the seat of her heart. Because on the outside, maybe we judge that, right? What was she writing to this man and telling him intimate things when she's married with 2 kids? But when we see her in the middle of her life and understand her fears and her anxieties, her novel had failed, the atom bomb had just gone off. She was fearful, there was anxiety, and here is a man who was writing to her about the things that matter. And then a man who was saying things like, a male writer needs 2 things, a wife and a typewriter, and they both must be in working order. Right? So then you're in her heart and you're understanding why this correspondence has become so important.
Thank you. Well, your depiction of the alcoholic personality was right on, too, because I've known closely some.
That wasn't hard for me.
So.
So yes, ma'am. You could just pass it down.
Just to play on the question that she asked, in the book you mentioned the fact that C.S. Lewis discarded the letters once he'd responded. So how did you have Joy's words to him if that was his practice?
That's why we get to call it fiction.
Okay.
But also we get to call it fiction, but I like to maybe put the word inspired in front of it, because what we do have are the letters she wrote to other people during that time. What we do have are the letters he wrote to other people during that time. And so what we do know is what they cared about, what they thought about, what was going on in the world, what they were concerned with, what he was debating at Oxford, what he had spoken about at the library when talking to children. Like, those are documented. So although we don't have the letters, we know what mattered to both of them, and we know how they talked, the cadence of their language in their letters and what they said. And of course they can't be perfectly accurate on this side of the grave, but they were as best as I could imagine after diving deep into the letters they already wrote to other people during those years. You know, he would write about the Socrates Club, or he would write about a debate he had. And so why wouldn't he be writing those things to Joy also? So it wasn't that hard to imagine what they might have been talking about. So that's what that came from. And same with their conversations. Especially when I started to see the ties in their life, the things that had been similar in their childhoods. For example, they're 16 and a half years apart, but at 12 years old, they both read Phantastes by George MacDonald. They had these little nodal points of connection that they obviously would have talked about, right? They both, she had this fairy, what she called fairyland kind of imagining of something better that she eventually realized in her mind was really heaven. But then she read Pilgrim's Regress, and I almost imagined her reading that and saying, how'd that man get in my head? Right? So they read the same fairy tales, they had read the same books. And then she had read books he hadn't read, and he had read books she hadn't read, and they just so. I wish I had those letters, though. I would not be sad if they showed up in Douglas's back closet, and he's lying to us. Yeah.
George Sayer was a student of Lewis's and later a professional friend and a walking partner, and wrote a biography of Lewis. And he speculated that if Joy hadn't come along, Lewis might have married Ruth Pitter, who was an accomplished writer herself.
Gorgeous poet.
Yeah. First question, does Ruth Pitter figure in your novel? And then sort of related to that, Don King wrote a biography of
I've read everything
Ruth
Don has
Pitter.
written, yeah. Except I didn't read that biography, but everything he's written about Joy and his critical studies and his publications, he's been invaluable.
Yeah, and he says that both Lewis and Pitter have kind of a responder's personality, and what the reason their relationship didn't work out is that Lewis needed an initiator and that Joy was that personality. And with regard to the poetry, do you know whether or not Lewis read those 45 sonnets, and if so, to what extent was that material in his being one?
Being one. You have to read the book. I'm not answering any of that. No, I'm kidding. But all of that is in the novel, and I do have to say that Don King has an essay or an article in the Wade magazine, the Wade Center magazine. It's a couple years old, but he compares and contrasts Ruth Pitter and Joy Davidman and their poetry. And it was instrumental in the scene that I wrote where I have Joy confront Lewis and ask him if he is in love with Ruth Pitter, because I wanted that to be part of the story. I needed that to be part of the story because Joy was a jealous woman, and there's a scene in there of it's George Sayers' wife who said that she, came into the house and said, "Who are you? And what do you?" Those are the things I would have liked to have left out because it makes her look, angry and jealous. But it's the truth. It's who she was. And Don W. King's article that he wrote for the Wade magazine talks about how even in the poetry, Ruth Pitter feels like she needs to be wooed, and Joy Davidman is a pursuer. She's out front with her feelings. This is how I feel. This is what it means. And Ruth is a little more subdued. I can't answer whether if Joy hadn't come along, he would have married Ruth. I tend to doubt it because I don't think he would have ever. I think he would have stayed in his confirmed old bachelor status, but that is only my guess. I think that only a woman like Joy could have broken down his defenses and entered his life that way. I was talking before about the two camps, and when I hear people use the word brash about her, I kind of, Elaine and I have talked about this on email a lot, what's with the name calling already? Like, can we not use names like brash, obnoxious? Why can't we say fiery and audacious and interesting? And so I think that it would only have taken that kind of woman to break down his defenses. But that's my humble opinion.
Comment on the role of the poetry and...
Oh, whether she saw that, okay. So, no one knows. I mean, I don't know a professional who says they know for sure. My guess is, and I do put it in the novel, that she does give him those poems. And I get my inspired guess from that is the fact that she wrote on the folder, Courage, 45 Love Sonnets for C.S. Lewis. They lived together, they were married. How did he not see 45 love sonnets that she compiled? Now, what you have to know about these 45 love sonnets is not all of them were written during the time she knew him. Some of them were written before she met him, but she compiled them in kind of a narrative format for him. So I believe, and I could be wrong, sorry Joy if I am, but I believe she did give them to him and that it did have an influence. So that is my humble novelist opinion.
Do you think he may have read them after they were married?
No, I think he read them before. But like I said, that's a guess. I'm not setting down some academic stake and saying, yeah. I'm pretty sure of my guess. I said it in my heart. That's the stake I put in my heart, but I don't know. I need to say that somewhere like here. I don't know. It looks like we have 2 minutes. Does anybody have a last question? Yes, ma'am. You have to say it in the mic. Sorry.
I just want to know, when she graduated from college, did she have a relationship with her Jewish family still in New York, or were all ties cut off when she became a Christian, or?
No. She had a relationship with her family. Now, she and her brother in later life had a break in their relationship. It's not, I don't really include it that much in the novel, so her biographies go really in depth into why that happened. But part of it was because she did a series of interviews and an article for the New York Post called Communist Girl, where she tells the history of her life and her family. And he believed that she didn't treat her parents fairly in those interviews, or him. And they had, I think some cruel things were said by her, some were said by him, but they had a break in their relationship. They did communicate at the end of her life, but they went a long while without talking. But she always had a relationship with her parents. Her parents came a few times, came to England to see her. It wasn't a good relationship, it wasn't a super close one, but she didn't cut anybody off when she became a Christian. So even her ex-husband, they remained close for all of their lasting lives. I mean, the reason we have so much about what she thought and felt during those days is because she wrote him letters about how she felt and what she thought. So it's very interesting, very complicated, as they say now. It's complicated. But I want to thank you all for coming. You could have done anything tonight, including be home on this freezing night. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.